The Dark Scrolls. In the kingdom of Valandria, beauty was law, and law was cruelty dressed in silk. No one defied it, not peasants with their sunburnt skin, not noble daughters with crooked teeth, and certainly not the king's own blood. But the second daughter of King Marsan IV was born soft, plump from infancy, with cheeks like ripe peaches and arms that folded into themselves. By the age of 5, she could not run without wheezing. By 10, the court jesters whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening. By 16, she had been given no suitor, no titles, no future, only food and silence. Her name was Seraphina, though the people rarely used it. They called her the Hog Princess, they called her in the kitchens. The golden cow, the guards muttered under their breath. They fattened her like they did geese before harvest, lavish meals of honeyed swan, cream-filled pastries, and goblets of clotted milk. It was not indulgence, it was deliberate, a punishment in velvet gloves. The court knew, the king knew, even Seraphina knew, but no one spoke of it. Until the day her older sister, Princess Alandra, was to marry the Archduke of Farvenmore, and a grand banquet was held. The nobles glittered. Alandra shimmered like fire in a dress of red glass beads. And Seraphina, dressed in a gown stitched too tight, was seated behind the pillars, out of view, yet present enough to be a reminder of what a daughter ought not to be. She tried to smile when her father toasted Alandra, tried to swallow her pride with the third sugared fig, but when she stood to excuse herself, her chair scraped loudly across the marble, and her ankle buckled beneath her weight. The silence that followed was not of sympathy, it was stifled laughter behind jeweled fans. That night King Marsin summoned his advisers. The kingdom could no longer bear the embarrassment, he said. A daughter unwed, unseemly, unsightly. She was a burden on the treasury and a blemish on royal lineage. A solution was whispered, one that chilled the candlelight in the room. She would be given away, not in marriage, not in honor, but in humiliation, to a slave, not a noble-turned servant, a true slave, captured from the edge of the Galdoran territories, dark-eyed and sullen, owned and unnamed. He had been bought years before to serve in the stables, barely speaking the court's language. His back bore scars like twisted vines, his hands always dirt-lined and calloused. No one knew where he came from. No one asked. But he was obedient, and he had no voice with which to refuse the king's command. By morning, Seraphina was informed of her fate, not by her father, but by a handmaiden with trembling lips. The words landed like frost. "You are to be given. Tonight." She laughed at first. Surely it was a jest, a final cruelty to amuse her sister. But when the guards came and led her to the stables instead of the royal chapel, she understood. They made her kneel before the slave, as though he were her prince. The nobles watched, some with masks of pity, most with amusement barely hidden. Her father did not come. Alandra threw rose petals on the ground mockingly, and the priest, in a half-mocking blessing, declared her gifted, not wedded. The slave did not speak. His eyes met hers, not with desire or pity, but a strange stillness, as if he saw not the flesh, not the shame, but something else. She looked away. They gave them a shack behind the servant quarters. No gold, no guards, no dignity. Her gowns were taken, her combs, her oils, her perfumes, all gone. What remained was her body, swollen and sore, and a man she did not know who sat on the floor with folded legs and watched her in silence. She braced herself the first night, expected pain, hands, laughter, or worse. But none came. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He brought her water. When she wept, he looked away, not out of indifference, but of respect. The silence between them was thick, not empty. On the third night she asked his name. He hesitated, then answered with a whisper, "Kyle." His voice was rough, like bark stripped from a tree. She asked where he came from. He did not answer. By the seventh night, she could no longer sit upright. Her back ached from the hard bedding. Her joints burned from the cold. She cursed herself, cursed the king, cursed her own softness. She thought of starving, of slipping away in silence. But when Kyle returned from the fields and found her curled against the wall, he placed something warm in her hands. Broth, salted and humble, but warm. "I will not let you die," he said. She laughed bitterly. "Why not? Isn't that what they want?" His answer was slow but deliberate. "Because I see you," she blinked. "You see me?" "You are not what they say," he replied. "You are not what they made you." That night something cracked open inside her. Not love, not yet, but a fracture in the wall she'd built around her heart since childhood. He did not flinch when her body shook with sobs. He did not mock the stretch marks on her belly, the rolls of her arms, the folds of her skin. He simply sat beside her, present, still. The days passed in rhythm. Kyle worked. She remained in the shack. But each night he brought back small things, a stolen apple, a sprig of lavender, a strip of cloth dyed blue. Gifts no prince would give, but treasures nonetheless. She began to speak more, to ask, to remember things long buried. "I used to sing," she told him one evening. "Sing now," he said. Her voice was hoarse, unused, but she sang, a lullaby her mother once whispered before the queen died. Her voice cracked, but he closed his eyes and listened. As the moon shifted from crescent to full, their silence softened into companionship. She began to see his scars, not just the ones on his back, but the ones in his gaze. He had known pain. Not like hers. His was raw, bloodied, and burned into flesh. But pain, nonetheless. She no longer saw him as her captor, nor he her as burden. Then came the storm. A nobleman from a distant province arrived at court, young, vain, and seeking entertainment. Word had spread of the beast bride given to a slave. He demanded to see her. The court, eager for scandal, allowed it. They dragged Serafina from the shack, dressed her in mockery, tight silks and powdered cheeks. She was made to stand before the visiting lord like an animal. He circled her, appraising her flesh, as one would a pig at market. He laughed. "She's bigger than the oxen," he said. Kyle was chained during the display, made to kneel at the far end of the hall, his fists clenched until blood dripped from his palms. Serafina said nothing, not because she accepted it, but because her voice had frozen into stone. But that night, back in their hut, she asked him, "Do I disgust you?" He answered not with words, but with action. He knelt before her, placed his forehead against her belly, not in worship, but in truth. "You are the only thing in this world that feels warm," she cried, and for the first time she did not feel alone. The nights grew colder after that. Not from the weather, summer still draped its damp heat across the land, but from the way silence returned to the royal halls. The cruel laughter faded. No one mentioned the princess anymore, as if banishing her to the slave quarters had erased her from the scrolls of history. She was not dead, but to them she was something worse, forgotten. Inside the small wooden hut tucked behind the crumbling wall near the stables, Serafina learned how to breathe again. The air there was not perfumed or filled with harp music. It was thick with sweat, manure, and morning dew, but it was real. It smelled of soil and iron. It tasted of survival. Kyle spoke little, but when he did, each word was chosen, as if it carried weight that language could barely contain. Serafina listened with a hunger she never knew, one not for food, but for meaning, for truth. He told her slowly over the days about the desert where he was born, of red sand that burned underfoot and a sky so wide it could swallow grief. He spoke of fire dances, of the stars his mother taught him to read, of the gods that lived in silence. "They say the gods abandon the broken," she said once. "They do not," he replied. "The broken are their mirrors." His words struck her like light through stained glass. She had always thought her suffering was punishment, that her body was rebellion, her heart a defect. But Kyle made her feel like a vessel of something sacred, something cracked, yes, but not empty. He never touched her unless she offered. And when she did, it was not in passion, but in healing. He would brush her hair with his fingers, slowly, untangling each knot. He traced the lines of her palms as if reading a map no one else could decipher. His hands were rough. Her skin was soft. But where they met, they fit. Days turned to weeks. Each morning, Kyle rose before the sun and returned after dusk. Serafina began to make the hut her own. She swept the dirt floor, folded what few linens they had, and stitched scraps of cloth into a makeshift curtain to block the evening glare. She began to hum again, and sometimes, when she thought no one was near, she danced, slowly, awkwardly, in circles, just to feel the weight of her body carried by something other than shame. But peace, like warmth, was never meant to last long in a kingdom ruled by pride. A wedding was announced. Princess Alandra, ever resplendent and cruel, was to be crowned Queen of Esthmar through marriage. The court rejoiced, banners were hung, a feast was planned that would last 7 days and nights, foreign dignitaries would attend, and King Marsaint, ever aware of appearances, remembered the daughter he had buried in silence. "We must not allow rumors to linger," he told his advisers. "Bring the forgotten one back. Dress her in civility. Let the world see that even our lowest refuse lives peacefully under my mercy." It was not forgiveness. It was theater. So they came, guards in gold, a carriage too fine for a girl dressed in linen. They did not knock. They burst in, dragging Serafina from her bed while Kyle was still in the fields. She screamed, bit one of them, tried to cling to the door frame, but it splintered under their boots. When Kyle returned, the hut was empty, save for the slow flicker of the candle she had left burning. Serafina was bathed in scented oils, her nails trimmed, her hair braided in gold thread. They stuffed her into a corset 2 sizes too small and painted her face until her skin no longer matched her neck. She said nothing. Let them poke, prod, lift, bind. Her body was no longer hers. It hadn't been in years. She was presented on the 5th night of the feast. In the center of the grand ballroom, beneath a chandelier of glass moons, she stood like a ghost, wearing flesh. The nobles applauded, more out of confusion than celebration. Some recognized her. Most only whispered, "Is that the one?" Alandra embraced her with a smile stretched thin as parchment. "You look radiant, sister," she said sweetly. "Truly, you clean up so well." Serafina bowed slightly. "Thank you," she replied. "So do pigs before slaughter." Laughter, nervous, scattered, followed, but Alandra's eyes narrowed and her grip on the goblet trembled. The king said little. He merely gestured for Serafina to stand near the musicians, displayed like an artifact. But even there she did not crumble, because Kyle had taught her how to hold her spine like iron. That night, when the festivities dulled and the torches flickered low, a shadow slipped through the servant gate. Kale had come. He wore the rags of his station, but his posture carried fire. He found her in the back garden, near the reflecting pool she used to cry into as a child. She turned before he spoke. "I knew you'd come." "I would cross fire," he said. She touched his face and he leaned into her palm. For a moment, time dissolved. The kingdom, the feast, the shame, all faded. It was just 2 people scarred by power, healed by each other. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "You never did." They'll never let me go. Then we take freedom, he said, not ask for it. That night they made plans, but fate, as it often does in palaces, listened. A servant boy overheard. A whisper in the corridor became a roar in the throne room. By morning, Kyle was chained in the dungeon, and Seraphina was confined to the East Tower, the very chamber her mother had died in, filled with dried roses and locked windows. The king was livid. "You dare shame your blood with that thing?" he roared. "He loved me more than you ever did," she spat. He struck her. Blood filled her mouth, but her eyes did not waver. He ordered Kale's execution at dawn. The scaffold was prepared. Not in secret, but in the center square, for all to witness the cleansing of royal disgrace. Seraphina watched from the tower window, her fists bloody from pounding the walls. Kyle stood between the guards, quiet, not broken, never broken. When the priest asked if he had last words, he looked up toward the tower. "I saw her," he said. The crowd murmured. "I saw her," he repeated, "not her weight, not her shame. Her—" Then he smiled, not at the sky, not at the priest, but at her where he knew she watched. It was a smile not of surrender, but of peace. The sword rose. Seraphina screamed, but thunder cracked across the sky. The blade stopped mid-air. Gasps. Rain began to fall, sudden and wild, drenching the wood, extinguishing the torches. A lightning bolt struck the western spire. The crowd scattered. The executioner faltered. In the chaos, Kale vanished. Some said he fled with aid from a rebel priest. Others claimed the gods spared him as a sign. But Seraphina knew better. He had promised her freedom. And freedom, once named, never dies quietly. In the days that followed, the kingdom tried to erase the scandal. The guards who failed were whipped. The servant who whispered was hanged, and Seraphina was officially declared mad with grief, confined permanently to her mother's tower. But behind the curtains she began to write. Letters folded in tiny scripts, sewn into hems, hidden in books, smuggled by maids with silent eyes. And in time word came back. Kale had made it across the riverlands. Safe, waiting. And so she waited too. Not passively, not broken. She studied maps, she listened to pigeons, she watched the guards change shifts. Every hour became part of a plan, because she was no longer the forgotten daughter. She was Seraphina of the Ashen Tower, and fire was blooming in her belly. There were no clocks in the tower, but Seraphina could measure time by the way the ivy grew across the window. At first she had tried to fight her imprisonment with rage. She screamed until her throat bled, threw porcelain against stone, refused meals, and wept into her mother's faded robes left in the armoire. But grief, when it is long enough, becomes a quieter thing. It no longer howls. It lingers like fog in the bones. And in that quiet, Seraphina found resolve. Her body had softened further in the weeks that followed. She could feel the extra weight pressing into her knees as she moved, her breath shorter on the staircase. The servants brought her only rich foods, cheese, cream, and meats, just like before. But she ate only what she needed to survive. No more. Not because she despised herself, but because she knew. To escape, she must become strong. She began walking the room in circles, over and over, until her calves burned. She climbed the old spiral steps that led to the broken bell tower, using her hands to pull herself when her legs failed. She practiced holding her breath, listening for footsteps beyond the door. She memorized the sound of each guard's walk, the heavy limp of Marin, the nervous shuffle of young Thomas, the dry cough of the old captain who checked locks at midnight. One night, during a rainstorm, a pigeon arrived, feathers soaked, trembling. It landed on her sill and waited. Tied to its leg was a scrap of cloth, no longer than a thumb. She untied it with trembling fingers. It read only 3 words: winter, smoke, river. She pressed it to her lips. Kyle was alive, and he was waiting. The next moon cycle, she tested the old latch on the window. Rusted, fragile. A hinge broke off in her hand. She stuffed cloth into the gap so it wouldn't creak. She began preparing. By then, the court had long stopped checking on her. They believed her to be broken, docile, mad. Occasionally, Alondra sent her gowns, mocking gifts in the latest court fashion. Serafina accepted them with grace, then tore them into strips to use as rope. She bribed one servant, an old woman with a blind eye, with the only treasure she had left, her mother's pearl comb. The woman whispered only once, "The northern wall is least guarded, between the statues of the mourning angels." Serafina waited for snow. Winter came early that year. The frost cracked the stones of the tower, and the guards grew lax in the cold. On the night of the solstice, when the kingdom celebrated the Feast of the Silver Flame, the palace was drunk with wine and firelight. From her window, Serafina saw the smoke rise from the great hall, curling into the night like fingers beckoning the gods. She tied her makeshift rope. She whispered her mother's name, and she climbed. Her arms screamed. Her breath tore through her lungs. The wind lashed her skin. But she did not stop. She slipped once, her heel grazing stone, but she clung tighter. Her hands bled. Her body wept, but she moved like the earth would collapse if she didn't. When her feet finally touched soil, she nearly collapsed, but she ran. The mourning angels stood in silence as she passed between them. No guards, no dogs, only moonlight and the soft crunch of snow underfoot. She reached the forest before the alarm sounded. Behind her, bells rang, horns, shouts. Ahead, darkness. She did not turn back. Cale was waiting in the woods, wrapped in a cloak of goat wool and silence. When he saw her stumble from the trees, his breath caught. He had not dared to hope she'd make it. But she had. She fell into his arms, and for a moment, neither spoke. His hand cradled the back of her head, his chest heaved, and her tears soaked into his shirt. "You came," she whispered. "I would wait 1,000 winters," he said. He had a horse, a stolen one likely, but strong. Together they rode, through the night, through the thorns, across frozen creeks and sleeping roads. They reached the river by dawn. The water was black, slow-moving, iced at the edges. A ferryman stood by a crooked post, his boat already prepared. He said nothing, only held out a hand. Cale gave him a coin carved with a symbol Serafina did not recognize. The boat swayed as they stepped on. As the far shore grew closer, Serafina turned for one last look at the kingdom she had once called home. Philandria, a place of marble towers, golden halls, and monstrous hearts. Her father's crown, her sister's throne, the tower where she nearly forgot herself. She did not weep. When they reached the other side, she stepped onto new soil. Free. But freedom, they would learn, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another war. They traveled for weeks, taking refuge in forests and forgotten villages. Kyle knew paths no map showed, shortcuts only told in slave songs, routes used by the lost to find each other. They spoke little during the day, always listening for hoofbeats or hounds. But at night, by firelight, they dreamed aloud. "We could build a home," Serafina said once, "near the sea, with windows that face the sun. With a garden," he added, "and a well, and a cat," he smiled. "A fat one." But reality gnawed at the edges of their hope. Food grew scarce. Serafina's body ached more each day. Her feet blistered, her joints swelled in the cold, and the weight she carried made every step harder. Cale tried to hide his worry, but she saw it. In the way he looked at her hands when they trembled, in how he cut his meals in half and gave her the larger share. "I'm slowing you down," she said one evening. "You are the reason I move at all," he replied. but her strength was fading. One night, deep in the forest near the border of Reuven Hollow, they were surrounded, not by soldiers, by men in leather armor, faces covered in soot and oil, armed with rusted blades, bandits, outlaws, the kind who sold flesh to the highest bidder. They tied Kyle first, then turned to Serafina. They laughed when they saw her. "What a rare catch," one said. "Royal meat with softness to spare." Kyle thrashed in his ropes. "Don't touch her." They struck him across the face. Serafina stood still. "You want coin?" she said. "I know where to get it." The leader, a scarred man with yellow teeth, raised an eyebrow. "Do you now?" "I'll take you there," she said, "but only if you let him go." He laughed. "You think you're in a place to bargain?" She did not flinch. The man circled her, considering. Then, with a grunt, he nodded. "Fine. You guide us. If you lie, we skin him alive." She nodded. "Deal." They walked for 2 days. Serafina led them east toward the ruins of an old chapel she remembered from a childhood hunt. But what she also remembered was the pit behind it, a shaft once used to hide plague corpses. Deep, unmarked, forgotten. When they reached the chapel, the bandits rested. She asked to relieve herself in the woods. They allowed it, one man following. She lured him away, then struck him with a stone. Kale had freed his wrists by then, slicing his bonds against a broken blade. When the leader realized Serafina had not returned, it was too late. Kale stormed the camp, wounded but roaring, and Serafina came from behind, torch in hand. They lit the chapel aflame. The bandits burned, screaming into the trees. Kyle and Serafina did not look back. After that night, the forest was different. It no longer felt like a place of exile, but of rebirth. They reached the coast weeks later. A village took them in, simple folk with no need for gold or gossip, just hands to till the earth and hearts willing to be kind. They built a cottage on the cliffside, 2 rooms, a chimney, a garden, and a cat, fat and white with one eye. Kyle carved wood for the village children. Serafina sang again. Her body remained heavy. Her joints ached in the mornings. But she no longer despised the weight. It was hers. It was real. It had carried her across kingdoms, through pain, through fire, through silence, and Kale loved every inch of it. They never married. No priest came, no vows were spoken, but in every gesture they wed themselves to each other, in the way he brushed her hair, in the way she warmed his hands after work, in the way they sat beneath the stars, her head on his shoulder, his hand on her belly, and silence between them, not hollow but full. Of all the names history might have called her, the obese princess, the disgraced daughter, the shame of Valandria, none mattered, because in this quiet corner of the world she was only Serafina, and that was enough. The sea did not speak in words, but in rhythms, waves lapping at the rocks like a sleeping heartbeat. Serafina would sit on the worn stone bench Kale built from driftwood and rubble, watching the gulls cut across the sky, her hand resting on her lap, eyes half closed. She had become something she never imagined. Still, not as in stagnant, but rooted, present. In the village by the cliffs, she was no longer a princess, nor a burden. They called her Lady Sarah, and though many guessed her origins from the curve of her vowels or the silver in her gaze, none asked. This was a place of quiet exiles, a place where no one was born perfect and no one expected perfection. Years passed. She grew wider with age, but slower too. Her knees ached more often than not. She moved like an oak tree, powerful but deliberate. Kyle's hair began to gray near the temples, his back bent slightly from years of carving and carrying, but his hands never failed her. Not when buttoning her gown, not when guiding her down the garden path, not when holding hers beneath the table at dusk. They never had children, not for lack of love, but perhaps because the gods knew they had enough to carry in each other. Instead, they became something else, a legend. Children in the village whispered about the giant lady and the silent man who came from the woods. Some said she was once a queen cursed by a jealous sorcerer. Others claimed she'd eaten an entire kingdom in one night, but none of them spoke with cruelty, only wonder. She laughed at their tales. Sometimes she added her own. Once, she told a boy who asked why her arms were so thick, "I fought a bear with only a spoon and a song." The boy gasped. Kale smiled. But peace, like the tide, always turns. One afternoon, as spring emerged from winter's shadow, a rider arrived, dust-covered, cloaked in black, bearing the crest of Valandria, the lion pierced by a crown. He did not enter the village proper, but stopped at the edge of the fields, dismounted, and asked only one question. "Is there a woman here, tall, fair-skinned, with a voice like copper?" The farmer who answered hesitated, then nodded. By nightfall, Serafina was at the shore again, the letter shaking in her hand. Her father was dead. King Marsain IV had died in his sleep, alone, rotting for 2 days before a servant dared open his chamber door. Princess Alandra had ascended, crowned not with celebration but fear. Her reign, according to the letter, was not loved, it was endured. The people whispered of her cruelty, of noblemen executed for minor slights, of taxes doubled and food stores drained, and now there were rumors. Rumors that a daughter long thought dead, yes, dead, had survived. A daughter with the blood of the old queen. A daughter whose image was seen in a traveling merchant's sketchbook, round-bodied, silver-eyed, sitting beside a man of dark skin and gentle hands. Serafina's hands trembled. She showed Kyle the letter. He read it silently, then looked at her. "You don't have to go." "I know," she said, "but I think I must." He did not question it. They left at dawn. The journey back to Valandria was not the same one they had fled. It was not fear that guided them now, but something else. Not revenge, not quite justice, a kind of reckoning, like returning to the place of an old wound to see if the skin had healed. When they reached the outer gates of the kingdom, the guards did not recognize her. Why would they? She no longer wore the shame they dressed her in. Her body was still large, her gait slow, but her presence had changed. She did not lower her eyes. Kyle walked beside her, not behind. They entered the capital as ghosts. The city had grown darker. The cobblestones, once swept clean for royal processions, were now crusted with waste. The shops were shuttered, the church bells silent. Outside the palace, a crowd had gathered, not in joy but protest. Hunger, some shouted, treason, others. And then the gates opened. Serafina walked through them, head high. Inside, Alandra sat on the throne like it belonged to her spine, not her blood. Her crown glittered too brightly, her fingers ringed with stolen gold. When she saw Serafina, her face paled. "Sister," Alandra said, voice taut. "I had thought you were dead," Serafina finished. "Yes, or mad. Perhaps I was both," Serafina said, "but I came back anyway." The court froze. Kyle stood behind her, quiet as a mountain. Alandra stood. Why return? Serafina walked slowly, each step deliberate, each breath steady. "Because you have forgotten what it means to rule with love, and the people will not forget forever." Alandra laughed. "And what would you do, sister? Rule them with songs and soft hands?" Serafina stepped closer. Number I would remind them that strength does not look like starvation, that kindness is not weakness, and that those cast into silence often return with the loudest truths. A silence fell. Then from the back of the hall someone knelt, then another, and another. Not nobles, Not lords, servants, guards, stable boys, the forgotten, the ones who remembered her. Alondra's face twisted. This is treason. No, Serafina said gently. This is remembering. Kyle stepped forward and placed something at the foot of the throne. Her mother's comb. The pearl glinted in the firelight. Alondra knew then that she had lost. Not her crown, but the story. And stories in the end are what truly rule kingdoms. The following weeks were chaos. Alondra fled the palace in the night, her guards abandoning her one by one. She was never caught, though some say she lived in a tower across the eastern sea, embittered and alone. Others say she drowned herself in the well behind their childhood home. Serafina was offered the throne. She refused. I have no need for marble and iron, she said. Only soil and breath and truth. Instead, she became something new. Not queen, not princess. She became the people's keeper. She remained in the palace for a time, not in the tower, but in the garden. She opened the kitchens to the poor, burned the ledgers of debt, invited the sick to rest in royal beds. The nobles grumbled, but they did not rise, because the people loved her, and she loved them. Kale built a school in the lower city. Children carved stories into wood blocks and painted the tales of the fat princess and the silent slave who taught a kingdom how to see. Years passed. Serafina grew older. Her legs no longer carried her far, but her voice deepened, rich and velvet. She was called Grandmother Serra by street vendors, the Tower Flame by poets, Mother of the Broken by the orphans she fed each night. One winter evening, Kyle did not rise from his bed. He smiled once, placed her hand over his heart and whispered, I saw you. Then he was gone. The world blurred. She did not eat for days. The gardens wilted, but on the seventh night, she stood again. Not because grief had passed, but because she still had work to do. She returned to the sea once more, ashes in a satchel, and cast them into the wind. Kyle had come from fire and shadow, and to the fire and shadow he returned, and when her time came, many years later, the entire kingdom mourned. She left no children, only stories. They say her body was buried in the orchard behind the chapel, beneath a tree that blooms even in winter. They say the wind near her grave smells faintly of lavender, and that when the waves are quiet, you can still hear her humming, just softly enough to make the broken feel whole again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.